Four Gonzaga players are competing for 2 spots in Mark Few's rotation next season. We're going to make a case for each of Jun Seok Yeo, Luka Krajnovic, Dusty Stromer, and Braden Huff on today's Locked On Zags.
You are Locked On Zags, your daily podcast on the Gonzaga Bulldogs. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
What is going on, y'all? Welcome to the Locked On Zags podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. I'm your host and longtime Gonzaga podcaster, Andy Patton, here to bring you news and updates on all things Zag athletics. Today's episode of Locked On Zags is brought to you by the Game Time app. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Happy Friday. Happy September. Out there, Zag Nation, we're discussing 4 Zags who are competing for what I suspect is only going to be 2 rotation spots next season, with 6 spots going to Ryan Nembhard, Nolan Hickman, Steele Venters, Anton Watson, Graham Ike, and Ben Gregg. We're going to discuss Jun Seok Yeo and Luka Krajnovic in the first segment. We're going to discuss Dusty Stromer and Braden Huff in the second segment. We're going to close out the show making my predictions on how the minutes will shake out for those 4 players, numbers 7 through 10 on Gonzaga's roster. We're going to start here talking about Jun Seok Yeo, the guy who I think is the most experienced, the oldest, and has been in the system not quite the longest. Braden Huff has technically been around for an entire year in Gonzaga's system, but of course, Jun Seok Yeo joined the team last year in January. So he's been around much longer than Luka Krajnovic, much longer than Dusty Stromer, even though Stromer is the first of these 4 players that we ever really heard about as a guy who's been on Gonzaga's radar for many, many years after a prolific high school basketball career at Notre Dame. But regardless, the case for Jun Seok Yeo feels very obvious. He's older. He's more experienced. He's 6'8". There's a lot of things going for Yeo. Again, he's 21 years old. He's coming in as a very non-traditional freshman. He's going to be, I think he's sophomore. They're considering him a sophomore. He's still got multiple years of eligibility, of course. He played in the FIBA U19 tournament many years ago, or I shouldn't say many, a couple of years ago for South Korea. And I think just the versatility that he offers, the size that he offers, the strength, the again, experience and age really creates a situation where he has what I envision to be a fairly substantial leg up over the other 3 players competing for rotation spots. Yeo he's drawn some comps to Rui, which I think is a little bit lazy, if we're being honest, but at 6'8", with a ton of athleticism, with making an adjustment from playing in a foreign country to kind of adjusting to the language barrier, the difference between South Korean basketball and Division I college basketball, like it took Rui a long time to make that adjustment. And the big question with Yeo is how long it's going to take him. Rui was effectively a 3-year plan. He played very little as a freshman. He played more as a sophomore, but still wasn't really even a rotation player. That was a stacked Gonzaga team that he was on his sophomore year. So it's understandable that he didn't play a ton. And then he, of course, exploded as a junior All-American, top 10 pick in the NBA draft. Now, a prolific NBA player for the Los Angeles Lakers. We all know the story there. For Yeo, he comes in already 2 years older than Rui was when he got to Gonzaga. Does that mean he's 2 years further along in his development? That's the question. That's the big question. I wish I had a better answer for you, but I don't know. I haven't been seeing him. I haven't been at practices. It's hard for me to know what he looks like at this point. But it is not unreasonable to expect that he is somebody who is ready to play right away. He has, out of this group of 4, he has, in my opinion, the highest upside by a fairly considerable amount. And that's not to take away from the upside of any of the other 3 players, in particular Stromer, who I think does have a very high upside. Yeo's is really high. The ceiling for Jun Seok Yeo is very, very good. It's lottery pick. It's legitimate NBA starter. I mean, it looks a lot like what we saw Rui become? So I think there are some reasons to believe that Yeo, with his advanced age, his more experience in the system than Stromer or Krajnovic, and his high upside, all of that kind of creates a perfect storm where I think that he fits the best in terms of being a rotation player in year one. Beyond all of that, his positional fit makes the most sense to be one of the key contributors off Gonzaga's bench. He has the versatility to play the 3 and the 4. And I think that's a huge element here because Gonzaga has 3 front court players in Ike, in Watson, in Gregg, and they haven't really played a 4th big in a long time. That's why I'm a little bit lower on Braden Huff's chances of being a key contributor next year. But having a bench player who could play the 4, but who can also play on the wing is really valuable. The Zags had that in Julian Strawther. They almost never used Strawther as a small ball 4, but he was an option to do so. Of course, they've done that with Corey Kispert in the past as well. He ended up playing a lot of minutes at the small ball 4 during his senior year. And I think Yeo being able to do both those things makes him even more valuable on top of all of the other things that we talked about that make him, in my mind, a really strong candidate to be a rotation piece for Gonzaga next season. The case for Luka Krajnovic. Krajnovic is in fact, he is the newest Gonzaga Bulldog on the roster, signed very recently in part in response to a couple of players leaving the program towards the last minute. We saw Marcus Adams come and go. Of course, Krajnovic was added before that happened, but still with Adams being gone, with Caden Perry medically retiring, even though that did not open up a scholarship spot, I do think that it created a bit more of a need. And Krajnovic comes in before those two things and really helps fill that kind of 4th guard spot that Gonzaga needed to fill. Krajnovic is 6'4", and he has experience playing professionally. And if you read the quotes from Mark Few, what he talked about when he gave that press release, when Gonzaga released that press release talking about the signing of Krajnovic, he said he's experienced, he's played against older players in Croatia. This to me is one of the biggest things that gives Krajnovic an advantage over somebody like Dusty Stromer, who I think is his primary competition as those kind of bigger guards vying for that last guard spot behind Nembhard and Hickman and to a lesser extent Steele Venters. And I think for Krajnovic, the fact that he is 19, so he's a little older than Stromer, although the age difference is pretty small. But Krajnovic played against 28-year-old Croatian guys. He played in a professional basketball league last year, was the most improved player in the league, averaged 17 points per game against professional athletes. More importantly, against grown men. I think that's a part of it. The talent level that Dusty Stromer played against in high school was very, very good. And the talent level in Croatia, you could make an argument, is maybe not as good as elite level high school basketball, but they're much older. And to be able to play against older players is a huge difference. It's a really, really big difference. Beyond that, Krajnovic, he's a good 3-point shooter. He's good at getting to the rim. He's excellent at drawing contact. He had three times more free throw attempts than anybody else on his team last year in Croatia. He also finished with 78% from the free throw line. He's a good free throw shooter, good 3-point shooter, good efficient scorer around the rim. He's got a little bit of size at 6'4", 180. He kind of fills that Malachi Smith, Rasir Bolton type role as a non-point guard kind of combo guard that you can use. Because Gonzaga loves to play those 2-guard lineups. They love the Nembhard and Hickman double lineups. I think it's going to be a big part of the team next year. We've seen, of course, a lot of 2-guard lineups in the past. And I think having a guard coming off the bench who is not a point guard is going to really be a solid fit because you don't need 3. You want 2. You had 2 last year, and then you have the Bolton Malachi Smith kind of sliding into those non-point guard roles. And I think Krajnovic could really fit that role for Gonzaga. However, a lot of what we just said to describe Luka Krajnovic really does also apply to Dusty Stromer. We're going to break down Dusty Stromer's case as well as the case for redshirt freshman big man Braden Huff after a word from today's sponsor, Game Time. Life is always so busy, and the last thing that I need to be stressed about is buying tickets to events. Thankfully, there's Game Time, which has killer deals on last-minute tickets for all of the events that I want to go to. When choosing seats for events, I always get stressed about trying to pick the right ones because I'm worried about the view. But Game Time has images of views from your seat so you know exactly what to expect when you arrive. Forget planning months in advance. Game Time is the place for last-minute ticket deals. They have deals on tickets right up to the day of the event. Get exclusive flash deals on tickets for football, basketball, baseball, concerts, comedy, theater, and more. The game time guarantee means you'll always get the best price. If you find tickets in the same section and row for less, Game Time will credit you 110% of the difference. So snag the tickets without the stress with Game Time. Download the Game Time app now, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONCollege, and you will get $20 off your first purchase. Terms do apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONCollege for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last-minute tickets, lowest prices, guaranteed. Folks, want to thank all of you for making Locked On Zags your first listen or your first watch of the day. Remind you all that we are on YouTube, and you can go to youtube.com, search Locked On Zags, and hit that big red subscribe button. We are very close to 2,000 subscribers. There's a chance we're going to get there in the next couple of weeks. If you want to help us do so, just go ahead and go to YouTube, hit that subscribe button. It is much appreciated. We're going to continue our conversation discussing the case for 4 of Gonzaga's players to get those final 2 rotation spots. We talked about Jun Seok Yeo and Luka Krajnovic and their case to make Gonzaga's rotation. Now we're going to talk about the true incoming freshman joining the team, a guy who's been affiliated with Gonzaga's program for many years, committed to Gonzaga a while ago, top 50 prospect in the class of 2023. That is Notre Dame's 6'6" guard wing, Dusty Stromer. And I mentioned the height because that is a huge selling point for Dusty. At 6'6", he has the versatility to play multiple different positions. He could be an oversized point guard. I don't think he's going to do that in year 1 necessarily, but that is, he possesses the skill set to potentially be that player for Gonzaga. He also can play the 2, and at 6'6", he could play the 3. So you have a positional flexibility to play the 1, the 2, and the 3. He thrived in an up-tempo offense at Notre Dame. I think that's a huge part of what Dusty could bring to Gonzaga, as he already has familiarity playing in the type of style that Gonzaga likes to play. He loves to get up and down the floor. He likes to score quickly in transition. He makes quick decisions with the basketball. A lot of things that are really, really appealing to a Mark Few-led offense. It's why they were so attracted to him in the first place. It's why they heavily pursued him for many years. It's why they ultimately ended up landing him. It's also why one of the other top schools on his list was Arizona. There was a reason for that, because him and Mark and Tommy both kind of saw the vision for who Dusty Stromer can be in their offense. Very fortunate that Gonzaga was the one to land him. Stromer is a multifaceted scorer. Not only can he shoot from beyond the arc, space the defense in a way that Gonzaga could really use coming off the bench, he also can put the ball on the deck. He can drive to the hoop. He can finish around the rim. He's got a little bit of a step back game to him. He's got a full bag. As an incoming freshman, he has a well-rounded and versatile offensive game. He also could fill the role, and I think this is the important part when talking about who's going to get these spots. All these guys are talented. There's no debate about that. If they're on Gonzaga's roster, if they get one of those 13 scholarships, it's because they can play. But when you're talking about who's going to fill out those final rotation spots and go from playing, just in garbage time to actually playing every single night or most every night, it's about fit with the current roster. Dusty can play the 2 or the 3. He can kind of play that hybrid combo guard roles. Again, be a floor spacer, be a secondary creator. You get the ball to him and let him go to work if the play breaks down a little bit. There's a lot of kind of different facets to his game that could make him a valuable piece to come off the bench and play multiple different roles in Mark Few's offense. He's also a hardworking defender. He's got some work to do there, as any incoming freshman does, but he's very tenacious on the defensive end of the floor and has high basketball IQ and instincts, which should allow him to be a passable defensive player in year 1. Final case that we're going to make here before we round out the show, discussing my actual thoughts and predictions for these 4 players heading into next season. The final case we're going to make is for redshirt freshman Braden Huff. Braden Huff joined the team last year as a freshman. He committed to Gonzaga a while ago and then rose up the ranks as a senior. It was a borderline top 100 guy who ended up getting into the 80s. I think in the rankings was one of the fastest rising guys because he had a dominant season at Glenbard West High School in Chicago, was Mr. Illinois in a really good basketball state. So really good stuff to see from him his senior year of high school. Sat out all of last season as a redshirt, 6'9" forward. He can space the floor as an outside shooter. You watch his high school tape. He can also put the ball on the deck, get to the rim, score through contact. He's not just a stretch 4. He's also a guy who can really bang down low and do some of the stuff you want from a more traditional big man. He's also a great passer. And I think that's a really big key for Braden Huff. Gonzaga relies on their big men being facilitators. Drew Timme was so excellent at this. His ability to pass. I mean, Drew Timme led the team in assists last year. The ability to make the right pass, find cutters, facilitate the offense with the ball in your hands is something that Gonzaga really values out of their bigs. When Gonzaga's bigs struggle to pass, it often costs them time on the floor. We've seen Gonzaga teams in the past where they didn't have the ability to do that high-low offense. Anton Watson's a great example. He struggled as a passer early in his career. And Gonzaga kind of went away from that high-low offense until he got better at it. And last year, he was one of their best playmakers. He improved so dramatically, and look what it did to his game. I mean, Anton's improvements last year were not only because of his improvements as a passer, but it opened up so much. It forced defenders to guard him differently. It allowed him to have the ball in his hands more comfortably away from the rim. He developed as a shooter, and then boom, he became a much more prolific offensive player. Braden Huff already having that ability to make the right read, make the right passes. He's still, going to have to get his game speed under him. Not having played a Division I basketball game is a knock on him. Granted, it's a knock on every single one of these guys, so it's not just him. But if he can find the ability to be a facilitating, passing big who can also step out and shoot the three, that makes him a matchup nightmare for opposing teams. He also has the most experience. I mentioned Drew Timme being a good passer. Guess who Braden Huff had to defend every single day in practice last year? Drew Timme. Learning from Drew and from Ben Gregg, who he will be, of course, competing with minutes for this year, and Anton Watson is such a valuable asset for Braden Huff. To have seen those guys, how they work in practice, what they do, what they watch in film, what they study, how they get better. For him to have had an entire year, 6 months longer than Jun Seok Yeo, a full year longer than Luka Krajnovic, longer than Dusty Stromer. For him to have had that experience gives him a tremendous leg up. The issue, of course, with Huff, and we'll talk about it more in the final segment, is whether he is as a big man, whether there is a need for him positionally. And I think that's the question. If you feel like Anton Watson or Ben Gregg could play some minutes at the three, perhaps Huff sneaks into that rotation, but that's kind of the big if. And with Yeo being a guy who could potentially play some four as well, it's just less of a positional need for Braden Huff than it might be for some of the other guys. Well, we've heard the case. We've heard the case for Jun Seok Yeo. We've heard the case for Luka Krajnovic, for Dusty Stromer, and now for Braden Huff. Now, we're going to close out the show with my thoughts and predictions for how this group might shake out next season in terms of minutes played, role on the team, and their future going forward in a Gonzaga uniform. All of that coming up right after this. All right, folks, still Andy Patton, still Locked On Zags, still talking about the four players competing for what I expect to be 2 rotation spots for Gonzaga. Mark Few has traditionally only played an 8-man rotation. We have occasionally seen a 9-man rotation, and that is possible with this team. We'll talk about that momentarily, but generally speaking, Gonzaga has played a firm 8-man rotation with players 9 and 10 generally getting more of those kind of garbage time minutes, not super consistent minutes throughout the season. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through these 4 players based on my predictions for how many minutes I think they're going to play next year, where they're going to be in that rotation, and kind of why I have those opinions. And quite honestly, spoiler alert, the order that we talked about them is the order that I think they're going to be in terms of the overall playing time. So we have the 6 who are locked into those rotation spots. As a reminder, that is Graham Ike, Anton Watson, Steele Venters, Nolan Hickman, and Ryan Nembhard would I project to be the starting 5, Ben Gregg as that 6th man. And then you have 7, 8, 9, and 10. 7, in my opinion, is probably going to be Jun Seok Yeo. I've talked about this on this podcast a handful of times. Yeo is the biggest wild card on this roster right now because the upside is so high. And whether he is ready to kind of cash in on that upside in year 1 is kind of what remains to be seen. If he's not, if the adjustment to the American style of basketball, the language barrier, if some of those things are still presenting as an issue for Yeo, it could hamper his ability to play big minutes. But if it's not, there's a real opportunity for him to not only be the 7th man, but to push for more. Out of these 4 players, I think the only one who reasonably could be a legitimate starter for Gonzaga next year is Jun Seok Yeo. I think it's possible. I think it's possible he starts for Steele Venters at the 3. I think it's possible he starts at the 3 with Steele Venters playing the 2 and Nolan Hickman coming off the bench. I don't know that I would say that I'm predicting that or even that it is likely, but I think that it is possible. If Yeo can be a 4-3 hybrid, can give you minutes at the 3 and at the small ball 4, you can put him at the top of the key, let him run that high-low offense, there is tremendous value. His size, his strength, again, his age at 21, his experience. We saw he was a tenacious rebounder during that FIBA tournament a couple years ago. Like, there's a lot of optimism about the kind of versatile offensive and defensive weapon that Jun Seok Yeo can be. Again, it's just a matter of whether he's ready to be that guy in year 1 or whether it takes a little bit more seasoning. That's the big question. If he's ready, the domino effect, the ripple effect, I think changes the rest of Gonzaga's trajectory. Whereas if he's not ready, I think that potentially opens up the door a little bit more so for Stromer and Huff. Whereas if Yeo is ready to play and is going to play a lot of the 3 and the 4, I think that actually opens up the rest of those kind of minutes to potentially go to somebody like Luka Krajnovic. So I'm making the rest of my predictions based on an assumption that Yeo is a player who can come in, play 12 to 15 minutes per game, similar production to Ben Gregg, who played about 12 minutes per game last year. And I think you could see him be a guy who climbs, who gets more minutes as the year goes on, as he gets more comfortable, as he gets more familiar with the offense, with his teammates. He could go from a guy playing 5 to 8 minutes per game early in the season to playing 12 to 15 minutes per game as you get into the WCC season. Where those minutes get taken away from kind of depends on how other players are playing and various other things, but it wouldn't surprise me whatsoever to see Yeo be the primary minutes guy out of this group of 4. After that, again, if Yeo is that guy, if he's playing 7th man minutes for Gonzaga next year, I think the next guy is Luka Krajnovic. And I think Krajnovic and Stromer is awfully close. And I wouldn't necessarily disagree with anybody who thinks Stromer is going to be that guy over Krajnovic. I think there are a lot of reasons to believe in both of them. For me, again, if Yeo's playing a bunch of the 3 and the 4, I think that opens up more minutes to have another guard on the floor. Because I don't think Yeo's really a guard. He's more of a wing, more of a forward. So if he's playing minutes, it could shift Venters to playing more at the guard spot, but I think it also opens up a potential spot for Krajnovic to play more. And again, we're talking about the 8th man in the rotation. This is not a big minute role. This is playing most every game, consistently playing, but it's maybe 8 to 10 minutes. That's typically what happens to that 8th player in Gonzaga's rotation. So we're not talking about a big role for Luka Krajnovic. But I think a guy who comes off the bench as that 4th guard behind Nembhard, behind Hickman, behind Venters, who I would envision playing more at the 2 because, again, Yeo is playing more at the 3. If that's the case, Krajnovic is that 4th guard. He's playing primarily at the 2. He's not really a point guard because I don't think there's going to be very few minutes in a game where neither Hickman or Nembhard are in the game. I think one of those 2 guys will almost always be on the floor for Gonzaga. So Krajnovic would be coming in to kind of spell either Venters or Hickman or Nembhard at the 2, playing off the ball, 3-point shooter, secondary creator, attacking the rim. Again, he's got a little bit more experience. He's also just more filled out. He's 2 inches shorter than Dusty Stromer, but I think 5 pounds heavier, according to Gonzaga's website. So he's just a little bit more filled out. He's a little bit older, and he has that experience playing against older guys. And I think all of that just nudges him above Stromer, especially when considering that he is a more natural 2 guard, whereas Dusty, I think, is a little small to play the 3. Maybe he's more of a 2, but I think he's a bit of a tweener right now. And I think I want to see more from him playing against Division I college players to kind of know where that fit is. Whereas I think for Krajnovic, it's a little bit more set. It's a little bit more clear what kind of role he could play. And the experience he's already picked up makes him, in my mind, more ready to contribute right away for Gonzaga. Number 9 in this case would be Dusty Stromer, and Dusty would get the freshman year Dominic Harris treatment. Ideally, the rest of the story for Dusty Stromer would go differently. Of course, Dom didn't play much as a freshman, with bigger expectations in year 2, missed the entire season with an unfortunate foot injury, got replaced in the lineup and rotation by new guys coming in, didn't play much in year 3, of course, hit the transfer portal. Ideally, that's not the story for Dusty Stromer, but a reminder that Dominic Harris was a top 50, 60 recruit in his class, You're looking at 24/7, ESPN, Rivals, On3, all those sites, they kind of all had him in that 45 to 60 range in his recruiting class. Dusty Stromer is right in that range, 48th, I believe, at 24/7 Sports, just inside the, I think, like 41st at ESPN, but is similar range in what is considered a slightly weaker class than Dominic Harris's class. I think Dusty brings, their games are not similar. I don't want to necessarily compare them as players. Dom is obviously quite a bit smaller, but a really lights out 3-point shooter, high level athlete. Dusty's a bit more, he's bigger. He's more capable of attacking the rim. There's differences in their game. But as a reminder, the way that Gonzaga treats freshmen who are not named Chet Holmgren and Jalen Suggs tends to be fairly similar. They don't often play rotation minutes. Corey Kispert is an unusual exception as a non-highly regarded freshman who played big minutes right away. And I know that there are comparisons between Kispert and Stromer, and I can understand making that argument. And I'm not necessarily saying that Stromer doesn't deserve to play right away or anything like that. I'm just saying that historically, Mark Few has treated freshmen ranked in this kind of area very, very similarly. And every year, it feels like we get a lot of hype, especially for freshmen who committed a long time ago, and expect these guys to come out and play right away. If I'm wrong, I'm wrong. If Dusty's ready to contribute right away and plays 15, 20, but probably not that many, but he plays 10 to 15 minutes per night and he deserves it, that would be fantastic. I think he's got really high upside, probably the second highest upside out of this group outside of Yeo. I just think looking back on the history of Mark Few as a head coach and looking at the fact that Dusty is very skinny. He's very small. Small is maybe not the right word. He's very thin. And I think looking at the size, the need to get stronger and more physical, the transformation that guys make between freshman and sophomore year is often tremendous. I think we'll see that from Dusty. But I think the combination of having an older, more experienced player in Krajnovic, having a player like Yeo, having the guards that they have with Venters and Hickman and Nembhard, I think creates a situation where Dusty is doing a lot of learning in year one and not a ton of playing. I mentioned the Dom treatment. Dom, for reference, 25 games as a freshman, 7.2 minutes. So it's not like we're talking about Dusty never seeing the floor. If Dusty played in 25 games and played about 7 minutes per night this year, I think that'd be pretty good. I think that would be a solid look at what he can bring. It would give him the opportunity to explore Gonzaga's offense in game situations, find his feel, get used to his teammates, and kind of start to understand what kind of role he can fill for Gonzaga. I just think that the opportunity for him to actually fill that role and find that ceiling and become the player that Mark Few believes he can be, that you and I believe that he can be, I think that happens as a sophomore. I just don't see a clear path to him playing enough as a freshman to fully fulfill that role, but I think we'll see glimpses of it. So if Dusty Stromer's number 9, that would mean, of course, that Braden Huff is number 10. And Huff, I'm going to, if Dusty's getting the Dom Harris treatment, then I'm going to say Huff is getting the Efton Reed treatment as the 4th big. Of course, Efton was the 4th big last year behind Timmy and Watson and Gregg. This year, Huff would be the 4th big behind Ike, Watson, and Gregg. Same group of guys. I think that Ike is probably not going to play as many minutes as Drew Timme did. Perhaps that means an uptick. It's most likely going to mean an uptick in minutes for Ben Gregg, is my expectation, as Ben will play more than the 12 minutes per game he played last year, which kind of leaves Huff playing the 4.6 minutes per game in 25 games, which is what Efton Reed played last year. That's kind of the role that I envision for Huff. It's not a great role. It's not a big role, but it's him getting his feet wet. It's a bigger role than he had last year as a redshirt, where he didn't get to play at all. Again, the Zags haven't played 4 bigs consistently in a long time. With Ike, Watson, and Gregg, barring an injury, which is possible, as those guys have all missed a little bit of time with injuries in the past, I don't think that Braden Huff is he's the least likely candidate out of this group to be in the rotation because he's more limited positionally. It's not that he's not talented. Like I said, everybody who's got a scholarship at Gonzaga can play ball. They're all good. But I think for Huff, it's just the positional flexibility isn't there. They don't need a stretch 4 like Braden Huff. They kind of have a guy like him in Ben Gregg. From everything I've seen, the highlights of Braden Huff in high school, which is all we can really go on, the scouting reports, the size, the strengths, they're really similar to Ben Gregg. Both guys are 6'9". Both guys are stretch fours. Both guys have a decent amount of physicality and can play around the rim, but aren't rim protectors, aren't high level defenders. They're stretch fours. That's what they are. Ben Gregg is just a better version of who Braden Huff will hopefully become. So I think for Braden, this year is more about, okay, I spent all of last year learning. I spent all of last year growing and developing. Now I get a chance to actually do some stuff, to get out on the floor, to play against those guys. And then it's year 3 or year 4 even, where he really kind of steps into the player that he's capable of being. I don't envision Braden Huff as being like, a 25-minute per game, 12, 15-point per game. I don't think that that's his ceiling. I think Braden Huff is probably at his best a 4-year, grinded out, play valuable minutes type of player. Maybe not a starter. Maybe he starts at some point in his career, but more of just kind of the hustle guy who provides a valuable role as a stretch four off the bench. That's kind of how I envision Braden Huff's career going. And that's not supposed to be viewed as some kind of insult to him or knock on him. It's just viewed as like that's the likely trajectory for this kind of player in Gonzaga's system. There's always the risk that he doesn't stick around. You hope that he does because Gonzaga's track record of developing big men behind the scenes is tremendous. The growth of Shemet Karnowski, the growth of Sam Dower, the growth of Ben Gregg, the growth of Kelly Olynyk. Like, there are so many stories. And of course, the transfer portal has made it harder for those stories to exist. Hopefully, Braden Huff will be that guy who turns into those players. Maybe he starts as a senior and has his best year. But I don't think we're going to see a big role for him next season because there's just not minutes to go around in front of him, because Ben Gregg is already such a similar player and just a more refined, more polished, older version of that type of player. So I think I think Braden Huff is the least likely of these 4 to be in Gonzaga's rotation next season, but that doesn't mean I don't have hope for him or optimism for him, showcasing some of that talent as soon as next season, but certainly being a guy who plays a bigger role for Gonzaga in the future. All right, that is going to do it for us today here on the Locked On Zags podcast. Again, enjoy your weekend, Zags fans. Happy September. We got player previews coming up. We're probably going to start those closer to October, but I bet we'll get to them towards the end of September as well. We'll, of course, continue to keep you updated on Gonzaga's schedule as it comes out, as we start finalizing dates and games for Gonzaga to play next season. We got some fun updates coming your way on the women's basketball team who had their fun trip over to Greece and Croatia. We'll talk about that. We got some more interviews lined up next week as well. All right here on the Locked On Zags podcast, available wherever you get your podcasts, also available on YouTube. Go hit that subscribe button there if you have not done so yet. Thank you so much for listening. Enjoy your weekend. And as always, go Zags.